Cool. Haha, here we go. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, or for rewatching if you're on the rewatch at this point. Um, yeah. For today, this is the last day of my promised intended. Hey guys. So the last day of my promised intended posting something every day for the month of August. I am I'm likely to continue posting stuff. I'm just not I'm not following through the promise to post every day. But I noticed that there's quite a few subjects that I haven't gotten to yet that I'm still really interested in and I've mentioned throughout the month. So for today, the headline was primarily focusing on meaning. I noticed as I felt into it that although I want to go in that kind of direction, I think I want to start in a slightly different place, and I actually don't know if I'm going to get as far as what John Vervaeke refers to as the meaning crisis. So this video may be mislabeled. I'll see if I can edit the description afterwards once I manage to play around with enough pieces. So what I'd like to do today is start with a way of synthesizing some of what I've been trying to talk about this month. And I think that this will head toward this question of meaning, although I think meaning is just one angle on the thing that I'm trying to address, something that I'm trying to account for and speak to. So in yesterday's post, I referenced how there's this sort of way of orienting to experience that I find cuts through a lot of cuts through. It is choosing not to listen primarily to the mind's babble, and instead looking at the structure of what is it that I'm actually experiencing. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit more about why that's important. What's so vital about that? And why it is that this leads to something that I've been wanting to tag wise knowing. In doing so, I'm going to end up hitting on a bunch of things that I think people have been talking about for thousands of years. Like, I don't think the foundation of what I'm talking about is especially novel. I think that in a particular way, one could argue, and I think there's an important exception, but one could argue that what I'm calling wise knowing is the thing that gets called insight in Vipassana meditation. In fact, the word Vipassana, I'm told, means insight, and it's referring to a specific kind of insight. But I think that there is an important difference in terms of how I'm orienting to it that I think matters for where we're going now. It's sort of the difference between why it is that all of these spiritual traditions, the context in which a bunch of these spiritual traditions arose was one where like scientific reasoning and an understanding of evolutionary theory and game theory and information theory. These were not understood concepts. They weren't known structures. We hadn't developed our mathematical sophistication, and that turns out to matter a lot. That doesn't mean that you have to know a lot of math in order to see what I'm talking about. At least I don't think so. I haven't tried seeing it without my level of knowledge of math, so it might turn out there's a subtlety there that's important. But I don't think so. I don't think it's essential. But I think that it is essential that as a species we've developed something new. So I want to point at a sequence of snapshots of experience that I think build up to a large picture. It's really key to understand that for each of these snapshots, I intend these to be things that you come to experience for yourself. But I'm going to be doing kind of a fast forward through a bunch of experiences that you probably can't cause yourself to have in sequence at that speed. It's a little bit like if you're if zipping through some bad analogies here. I think the most relatable analogy, and I don't mean the superiority element that this implies. There's a weird thing that our culture does with children, and when you're referring to people in analogy to children, I don't mean the superiority thing at all. If you were trying to describe to a child or to a teenager what some of the developmental stages are in psychology, you might run into a problem of not being able to describe in any way that they can relate to the stages beyond where they are, and certainly not the ones that are 2 stages beyond where they are. But they might be able to have sort of a mental simulacrum. So what I'm going to try to do is gesture at a sequence that I think can highlight something, and that if you sort of hold as plausible that what I'm describing is close to accurate, then I think this suggests an interesting picture. So with that level of abstraction, let me see if I can dig into this. So this business of really looking closely at experience. Well, why? What's so important about that? What's so novel? Why is it that all of these mystical traditions have been emphasizing this point for so long? Oh, just like pay attention to your breath, meditate on your breath. Why? What's so critical about the breath? Well, I claim that has very little to do with the breath. It's the fact that there's some interesting things about the breath's properties that you can argue are important, but I don't think that's the essence. There's a very particular confusion that most of us run into basically all the time. It's part of the foundation of how modern culture works, which is that we can't reliably distinguish between our experience and our mental interpretation of the experience. Now, sometimes this runs into some confusion, because what exactly do I mean by mind? What is a mental interpretation? It's very easy to get in loops, because if I give you a concept, this feeds the mind, and then the mind goes off and babbles about its understanding. So I want to point at an experience of the thing that I'm talking about. Right? So if you're game for sort of walking along with me, then I think I can show you a glimpse of this. It's possible, I remember writing this earlier this month, but I don't remember if I decided to post this, so this might be a repeat of something I've said earlier this month. Oh yeah, that's right, I did it with the memory thing of the how do you know. So earlier I'd said, try to call to mind, what was the first thing you ate today? Okay. So there's a certain sequence, I claim, that has to happen in order for that to occur. And if you watch the process, not just of answering the question, like it's not a trick question. A classic one that I've used in a number of other cases is, what is the capital city of France? Okay. There's an experience that happens on the inside. There's a very specific experience that has a sequence that basically everyone seems to go through. There are variations on a lot of the details, but the overall structure seems to be the same for everyone I've talked to. And that sequence is, there's first this process of hearing the question, understanding it, holding it in some sense, and then you wonder, you think about it. This process often happens very quickly, so that these two steps end up feeling the same. I'll give you another example in a minute that I think will highlight how different these really are. So there's this effort to remember, some sort of trying, as though you are passing an instruction off to something else. Then that something else goes off, does some processing that you don't see, and then comes back and answers. What you ate for breakfast was this. Oh, the capital city of France is this. And you experience this. It's like, oh, here's your answer. And you listen to the answer, and then you know whether it's right. Okay? So here I'm making a curious distinction. I'm sort of waving my hands about the difference between you and this process. Okay? I'm not trying to be very precise about what exactly these functions are. I'm trying to point at the experience on the inside. Okay? Another case where this shows up, I'll just give one other kind of example. So what is 23 times 17? Okay. So for many people, there's some sort of, like, you take in that process, you take in that idea, and then there's a reaction. For many people, that reaction is very fast, like, ugh, math. Like, I don't want to think about it. Do I have to? Or, no, that's just stupid. Let me just listen to the end result of what he says. Okay. Like, a lot of people have responses like that. Some will have a response that will feel like, well, what is 23 times 17? And this interaction with this other aspect ends up having a lot more iterations. There's a process that, for me, this goes something like, well, what's 23 times 17? And when I wonder, which is passing it on to this, it goes back and goes, don't know the answer, but here's a method. And the method that usually appears, yes, it's 391. So the and I can give you a quick snapshot of how to do that if you like. But this, I don't mean this as a math class, and I certainly don't mean it as a computation class. What I'm trying to do is highlight a way that when you do an intentional mental engagement with, sorry, not a mental engagement, when you intentionally watch the process of mental engagement, you can see this kind of interaction happening. That's what I'm wanting to highlight. There's this something like a gap that if you pay attention to it, you can watch, where you take in this question, and then the mind, this process I'm calling the mind, goes off and does something and then comes back and gives you your answers. And you decide whether that's valid. Like for me, the default thing that would come to mind first, although I've given this example many times, so actually I have a different default now, but when I first encountered this question, 23 times 17, I would see, this is mirrored because I have to visualize for me, it's 2, 3, a little x, 1, 7, and a line. And then I try to do the spatial organization of doing the multiplication algorithm. That's the default thing that my mind zips to. Okay. For some people, there's a different method that will pop to mind, which is difference of squares. But the method doesn't actually matter that much. What matters is the way in which the method comes to you. You think, what is 23 times 17? And then the method comes to you. And then you put in effort to try to do this method, to try to use it. So when I do this multiplication thing and I'm looking 2, 3, x, 1, 7 line, I know that the first multiplication I need to do is 7 times 3. What is 7 times 3? Oh, poop, poop, it's 21. Oh, okay, yes, that's right, it's 21. Okay, so that's the interaction that I'm trying to highlight. Okay? It's the same thing that happens when you're trying to remember someone's name, like you're trying to remember an actor's name. Well, what was that actor's name? What was it? It's like it began with an A, and what was that? Well, it'll come to me later. And then later on, it just sort of explodes into your mind. Just like, oh, blah, 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 blah. Like, oh, right. I guess that's correct. It's really curious that you can know that it's correct, but you can't know what the answer is. It's just very fascinating. So the reason for noticing this, one of the key reasons for noticing this gap, is that the experience of getting grounded in what it is that you actually experience about your mind highlights a couple of things that are very telling, extremely telling. If you've ever listened to people like Eckhart Tolle talk about, like, whoa, yes, he wrote The Power of Now and A New Earth. But most of what he emphasizes, in my opinion, comes down to, oh, there is no later, there is no elsewhere, there's just now. The ego likes to believe in now. And if you keep focusing, the ego likes to believe in later. And if you, and in other times, and in all of these stories, and likes to rehearse, and like, oh yes, this is a problem, and how do I deal with this? And that creates suffering. Because it's a hallucination. There's only now. It sounds like today's garbage day, so there may be a garbage truck going by. Hopefully I'll still be audible as that happens. So there's a lot of value in just sort of the brute force, okay, let me just stare at now. Like, what is the experience of being right now? Well, it's the only experience you ever have. But there's one of the main reasons for doing this is that the mind, this thing that I'm calling the mind, and I'm just going to give you this claim. I'm giving you a series of claims to try to highlight something, but I claim that you can actually see any one piece of this for yourself. And I'll gesture towards how you come to see this for yourself. But I want to talk about what that process is like, because there's a self-reference loop here that can be very slippery. The mind has a model, but normally, not everyone has this, but basically everybody in the modern world has this. The mind has a model of itself about how it works and what it does. If you think about, well, how is it that you recall what you ate for breakfast? The question that when I ask you something like that, how do you recall what you ate for breakfast? Without the context of the rest of this conversation, the question that most people answer is, what thoughts come to mind when you ask your mind how you remember what you ate for breakfast? I claim that's a different question. I emphasized this in yesterday's post, and this is a very slippery point. There's a huge gap, a huge critical gap that is usually invisible to most people most of the time, because it's not part of the mind's model. There's a huge gap between what are you experiencing and what thoughts do you have about what you are experiencing. Because that's not a difference that most minds know to model. So what you end up with is a bunch of very weird pictures, and they don't look weird on the inside. Like when you're in the habit of referring to your mind, or deferring, I should say, when you're in the habit of deferring to your mind, the mind has all of these thoughts. It has a kind of internal consistency. Right? If for those of you who are familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work, he wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, which does a thorough job of debunking a lot of the stereotypical ideas of how the left and right brain work. Like that, it's not like creative versus analytical. That's not really how it works. But that there is a meaningful difference, and there's a lot of convergence on what the meaningful difference is. A major thing that I'm talking about here in Ian McGilchrist's terms is the way in which the left hemisphere loses track of the fact that there is a right hemisphere that is worth listening to. It instead creates basically an icon for the right hemisphere, if it does anything like that at all, and then points at the icon to ask itself what it thinks the right hemisphere is doing. The right hemisphere doesn't have a symmetric problem. So, and if none of that made sense to you about the brain structure, don't worry about it. It's not critical to my argument. It's just an interesting reference that I think is worth knowing about. But the experiential component, the way this is experienced on the inside, is that there is an illusory, it doesn't feel illusory on the inside, but there is an experience of a kind of coherence to the world, that when you start examining how that coherence works, it rapidly breaks down. It doesn't make sense. And there's a disinclination to look. There's a lack of care. The fact that we don't experience the passage of time, that seems pretty important. If you actually reflect on it and you stare at it, there's something important about that. We are actively, constantly wrong about what our lived experience of time is. Right? And that forms the foundation of how we make decisions and what it is that we focus on trying to figure out and what we think is important to do. And you can make this point to people. You can maybe even listen to this point, and there's this sense of, well, I guess so. It's an interesting philosophical point, I guess. But whatever, I still need to deal with my chores, and I still have to do this and that, and it's like, how do you deal with the pragmatics? Well, how do you know you need to deal with the pragmatics? I don't mean this as like a sort of like freshman philosophy. Like, how do you know anything? He's like, this is like some kind of like great insight of babble that sounds really smart. No, I'm looking at the fact that there's a kind of insanity that is almost universal, that is to ignore the fact that the structure of our lived experience doesn't match the thing that we keep referring to as the foundation of how we make decisions. And even in the language that I just said, there's a basic incoherence. It assumes the thing that is ignoring the way that our experience is lived. And there's a kind of, well, so? Even if we can intellectually track this, there's sort of like, okay, but that's fine. I'm still going to experience the passage of time. That's how this stuff works. Right? So what I'm trying to point at is not, oh, there's a thing you need to be doing differently. That's more of the should stuff. I'm trying to highlight the way in which there's a kind of disconnect between our experience and what our mind presents. And we are in the habit of listening to our minds. There's a structural reason for this. And it's not that this is bad. It's that and in many cases, it's highly adaptive. It's very useful. It's incredibly powerful. It's a precious function. The problem is the mind has no ability on its own to become more accurate. This is another way of describing the thing that I've been talking about when I refer to there's a default towards mind shatter, and another way of describing the mind in terms of memetics, or what we're calling demons, clockwork demons at the beginning of this month, the mind is the platform, it's the system that memes run on. It's not the only piece, but it's a major piece. It's the function of the mind. One of the primary functions of the mind is memetic evolution and propagation. So, when you see this directly, not as a thought, like I'm giving you these concepts so that the mind has a way of holding on to what I'm talking about. But there's a key step that no concept can do. Only you can do, which is to direct your attention in a way that shapes the mind's relationship with you. Before you do that, there is this kind of illusion of a self that appears in the mind. It's like this little icon. I talked about this, I think, in my first video this month. Right? There's an icon that exists in the mind that is of the same type as the icons you use in order to track other people. This is the thing of like if I'm thinking about how you are going to interact with a mutual friend of ours, I have to have a mental model of you and a mental model of our mutual friend. And if I'm going to think about how you two interact and how you will think about each other, I have to have a model of your model of them. And I have to have a model of their model of you. And so there's these recursive icons that exist. But what if the two of you are going to go off and talk about me? I have to have a way of thinking about how you think of me and about how our mutual friend thinks of me, and the way that you two are syncing up back and forth about your impressions of your models of me. So that kind of model of me has the same type, it's the same basic structure as my model of each of you. So there's something very much like that, an icon that is very much like that, that the mind uses to say me. But if you, the experiencing being, and there's a lot of fuzz of, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, there's a slipperiness. This is a bit of a footnote, but there's a slipperiness here where if I tell the mind, figure out what that means, it goes off and does some kind of computation and then comes back and says, this is what it means. There's a basic problem in that the mind is still not making the, I find myself wanting to make a programming reference here. It's not using the icon as a pointer to consciousness. So what would it mean for the mind to stop insulating its processes that have to do with me, and instead have me point at experience, at subjectivity? Well, you can't ask the mind that. You have to look. You have to concentrate. You have to keep saying, mind, point at me. And it goes off and says, this is what you are. And you go, no. This is what I am. Then it goes off and does some computation in the background and then comes back and says, okay, this is what you are, right here. I'm like, no mind. This right here. So just you go through this cycle a whole bunch of times, and then there's a kind of tipping point that happens, which in terms of memetic evolution is the point where your consciousness can now engage more systematically with providing a specific kind of evolutionary environment on your mind, where you can start to get your mind to systematically choose clarifying memes instead of bullshit memes, where it can create a systematic evolutionary environment. Okay. So there's a lot more to say there, and in particular, something of what that subjective experience shift is, of what happens when you get an identity shift, when the mental structure of the self that is in the mind, the thing that normally gets called the ego, when that has a transformation such that it has a systematic way of pointing, doesn't systematically point, but has a systematic way of pointing at consciousness, there's an important shift that happens. Okay. And I want you to notice how everything I'm saying is for the mind. Everything I'm saying is about building an infrastructure so that the mind's powers, its strengths, its beauty, its fantastical capacities can be in service of clarity. It can be in service of fitting to reality, including the reality of your own subjective experience. So I have a bit more to say, but I'm wanting to pause there and take a look to see what kind of comments are coming up. Let's see. Rupert says a couple of times I told the process, "Oh, not sure about that. Check just to make sure." Yeah, that definitely happens. Marcello says, "Me? What's Capital Press?" Okay, this let me just skim to see. Okay, that is a cool experience. I appreciate you sharing, Marcello. Yeah, I think so. There was a comment that I saw in response to the announcement for this this video. Someone saying that what I'm talking about in terms of direct introspective access, saying something like, "Oh, yeah, I have that too, but I don't see what's so wise about that. I don't like. What's the big deal?" The big deal isn't that there's introspective access. That's not the key. I think, sorry, let me create the bridge. Marcello gives us a detailed experience of trying to sort out, well, what's the capital of France? Well, how do I experience the process of doing that query? And that's fantastic. Getting a chance to see exactly how that query process works, I think, is very valuable. But the act of looking at that, this to me is the key part, the act of looking at how your mind works in real time, not how your mind claims it works, but how your mind actually works. Watching that in real time directs the mind to improve its model of itself. That's really important. It's really important. One of the reasons it's so important is, I can go through a whole laundry list here. One of the big reasons it's important is because a huge key way that bullshit works in the human psyche is by distraction. It's by keeping you from noticing parts of the nature of your own experience. If you can get the mind to have enough of the right kinds of self-reference loops, then it loses the ability to systematically distract you. Right? So that ends up being really, 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 really helpful, because then your mind can be in service of hunting down and eliminating bullshit. And it's not like you need that in order to do so, but I think you need some degree of it. I think you do need some degree of it. But the process of attuning your mind to keep referencing reality, like back in terms of the hemispheres, it seems like there's even if this is just an analogy, I think it's a useful analogy. If you imagine that the left hemisphere by default tries, like in general, the way that the two hemispheres work in my understanding of McGilchrist's model, the left hemisphere focuses on details and then tries to build up a whole. And it tries to make sure that there's internal consistency and wants to grab some sort of chunk of a thing that it wants to categorize things in ways that it can recognize so that it can run known computations. The right hemisphere contextualizes. It works with the big picture. It does it kind of all at once. This is This is the kind of thing where if you're driving or riding at nighttime and you see some kind of strange shape and you're staring at it going, is that a deer, or is that just a log, or like what is that on the side of the road? And then as you get closer, there's this experience of examining details and trying to make sense of it, and then bam, suddenly it's a box. You know it's a box. It's clearly a box. You see it. The examining the details is a left hemisphere function. It's like, what is that part there? Is that this? But the all at once, no, this is the answer, comes from the right hemisphere getting enough information through the senses and through the left hemisphere's attempts to examine details, and then just asserts this is what it is. It's an all at once apprehension. So one of the big challenges is the right hemisphere knows about the two hemispheres and is accounting for it because it's trying to do context. But the left hemisphere sort of doesn't know there's a right hemisphere, or like thinks that it's secondary or something like that. It doesn't have, it has kind of a blindness. So a big chunk of this process is how do you get the functions of the left hemisphere, which are important, to have sort of an open port to the information of the right hemisphere. This is a major issue in our modern culture, where there's a lot of focus on a very particular type of analytic certainty and ideology. There's a lot of internal consistency that ends up being an obsession, rather than stepping back and saying, well, it turns out everything's complicated. That doesn't mean everything's incomprehensible, but it's all interconnected, and this doesn't have to be some vague mystical thing. There's actually a deep complexity about the way that everything works, and fundamentally, there's a kind of unknowingness. So how do you get your models to be precise enough that you can talk about specifics about what would be good to do for policy? How do you design roads? What do we do about these political movements? What do we do about health? But that there's a humility about recognizing that we don't know the whole context and that there's an ongoing evolution. I'm noticing a feeling like I'm sort of meandering into the weeds, so I want to pull out a little bit and reorient here. So there's a particular kind of experience that I think is really useful to have. This often comes as one of the early insights from doing a lot of meditation. I'll just tell you what the experience is. But when I talk about wise knowing, what I'm talking about is this process of pointing your attention at something until your mind matches reality in a way that gives this apprehension of, oh yeah, okay, right, it's a box. You can be wrong, but the kind of thing it means to be wrong when you've gathered enough evidence, it's like if you're staring at the box and you see that it's a box, and your friend next to you says, oh, that's a deer, and you're staring at it, you're going, no, it's not. If all the people in the car say, that's a deer, you're still looking at it, you're going, no, it's not. You guys are mistaken. Right? There's a confidence there that's coming from the clarity of the intertwining of your various layers of experience, the way that it all synthesizes. That doesn't mean that wise knowing can't be mistaken, but it means that it's not influentiable the same way as, for instance, opinions about what we should do about gun control. Right? Or the number of chromosomes in the human genome. Like, I honestly forget whether it's 23 or 26. I keep getting that number mixed up a bit. And it doesn't matter in a particular way because I'm not interacting with things that make that numerical difference matter. At least not directly. And when I do, then that number matters. So in terms of this meditative process, this sort of meditative insight, if you just pause, you take a moment to notice your own body. If you want to walk along with this, you're welcome to. This is a very easy thing to catch a glimpse of, I think. If you get into stillness, particularly if you take a few moments to just take a breath with a longer exhale than an inhale. And then you check in with your body. This doesn't have to be a detailed thing. This is just on a scale of like 0 to 10, where 0 is completely relaxed, totally at ease, could fall asleep. And 10 is, I am currently having a panic attack. I mean, how activated is your body? And just notice and give it a number. Right now mine's something like 4. And from there, if you just pause, for most people you only need about 3 seconds, but now that I'm about to explain this, many people need about 15 seconds or so. It's a sneaky reason for this, but let me give you an invitation to experience this. I'm just going to invite you to pause. Just be physically still. If you want to have a place to put your attention, just focus on your breath. There's nothing special about your breath. It's just something changing so that your mind doesn't get too bored. I'm just going to pause for a few seconds. And I just want you to notice what happens. That's all. Okay. For most people, that will have been plenty of time. So, a couple of things to notice. First off, did you have thoughts leap to mind that you didn't ask for? And what I mean by that is when you think about something like, well, what did I eat for breakfast this morning? Then you got a thought. You asked for that thought. When you're trying to remember somebody's name and then 5 minutes later the name bursts into your mind, you asked for that thought. But if just now a thought leaped to mind of, oh, this is weird. Like, my guess is you didn't ask, hey, mind, what's my opinion about this situation? Or if you did, you didn't notice yourself asking your mind to produce that. Right? So that's the first question. Did something leap to mind that you didn't ask for? Then the second question is, if so, what effect did it have on your body? Did it increase the number towards more activation? Did it decrease the number towards more calmness? Did it have no effect? So, for most people, I've run this in some reasonably sized groups, like in the ballpark of between 20 and 50 people. We get about 2-ish folk who have an experience of becoming more calm, in large part because they're familiar with something like meditation. They know how to still their minds. But for the considerable majority of people, there's an experience of the thought comes up and it creates activation. It increases the number. So the one way that this often gets expressed is one of the early insights in meditation is, oh, I don't have as much control over my mind as I thought. And secretly that's good. Because the you that is saying that is actually another module of the mind. It's the ego thing over here. Like, oh, I don't have as much control over my whole mind as I thought. Yes, that's true. Also, the liver doesn't have total control over the body. It has some sway. And so, and that's good, because there are other processes in the mind that you want to be able to call on. But that, to me, that's not the key thing to focus on. It's not just, oh, I don't have control. It's what the lack of control does. If you're going around, I want you to imagine that this is standard. Right? This is just the standard thing your mind does. It flings in thoughts that activate you, that create more alertness, more anxiety, more fear, more like it's an increase in sympathetic nervous system activation, which isn't bad, but it is related to the fight or flight response. So if you would just imagine that that is general, that's always going on. Your mind is just flinging thoughts and processes into your consciousness, and what that's doing is reaching down and activating your body. And goes activate, 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 activate. If that's going on all the time, and it's going on so often that it's normal, you don't even notice. You're not even, you're not even conscious of most of the thoughts that you're having throughout the day. The thoughts just fly through your consciousness, kind of. You sort of don't pay them heed, which is to say that you don't ask your mind to remember them and to log the fact that that thought came into consciousness. And then it's activating the body. And then the body activation encourages you to try to solve more problems and to try to make your situation better. So if this is constantly going on, for one thing, life is going to seem a lot more anxiety-provoking than it actually is. You're going to feel like that's just a real fact about life, and you're not going to notice that you're doing any of that. There's a particular way where you are constantly miserable and constantly kind of freaked out, exhausted. And it's not going to seem that way when you introspect, because when you introspect, a lot of people do this process of asking their mind what's going on, and the mind outputs something that fits. It's an evolutionary fit with this state. So if you do enough meditation, and this is, I don't think this is the only way to get there, but this is like the most, over the last several millennia, this is the most stable way that we know to get this insight into the structure of the mind, so that the mind is accurately reflecting back this fact about itself. When you meditate across enough instances and you keep consciously noticing this kind of activation, you start to notice it throughout your day as well. You start to notice this all the time, and it becomes this reality about, oh, there's this thing that I haven't been noticing about how I work. It turns out that there's a reason for that activation. Some people have slightly different mental architectures that that don't result in this kind of activation. They'll do some different things, and I don't mean to alienate the folk who don't experience it this way. But there's this a huge amount of that activation is actually part of the infrastructure for running memes, for running specifically the bullshit variety of meme. When you become conscious of that, that is to say, you're getting your mind to accurately reflect the fact that this is going on, which turns out to be unsustainable for bullshit memes. It's an evolutionary pressure against, a mimetic evolutionary pressure against that breed of meme in your own psyche in comparison to memes that are tracking truth. Which, the clearer you are about how your mind works, which is to say the more accurate your mind's reflection of itself is, the more obvious that becomes to you. The more this, the less this, what I'm saying sounds like claims about mimetics and about the nature of consciousness, and the more it seems like a direct observation you are making. It is immensely evident. It has a lot of the experiential nature. I mentioned this in yesterday's post. And I apologize for those of you who don't know this experience. This to me is one of the great tragedies of math education, not teaching math, instead teaching computation and doing so in a traumatizing way. There is something very beautiful in math that I don't see anywhere else to this degree. There is something gorgeous about the process of actually understanding a proof. It's not about recognizing that the logic is correct and agreeing that you can rely on it. It's that if you sort of, it is properly a kind of meditation. If you sort of meditate on the proof, you sort of take it in, you trace it, you look at it, you wrestle with it. Why would this be? Why does this make sense? I can agree that it's logically correct, but what is it saying? There's a point where, bam, it's a box. Bam, there's an apprehension where you get it. When you get the proof, when you have it, and it makes sense to you, the kind of thing that it does to make sense creates this like one thing it often creates is a sense of euphoria, a sense of bliss. This is actually getting in touch with the same thing, I claim, the same thing that mystics have been talking about, that when you get this transcendent insight into the nature of yourself, you realize that all is bliss. You're actually getting a glimpse of this. There is this moment where you get the proof, and now you know. You know that reality must be this way. So that's the same kind of thing that I am gesturing towards in terms of recognizing the nature of your mind and seeing the way that this affects mimetic evolution in your own psyche. You don't have to take any of these as claims. The purpose of these claims is to create a shape that your mind as it currently is can work with. But if you can direct the mind to be accurately reflect its own nature and its relationship to you, I mean, I don't think that process ever ends. It can't end. I think one way that you see this in mathematics is Gödel's incompleteness theorem. The Machine Intelligence Research Institute keeps running into this as something they at least used to call the Lobstickle. For those of you who know that reference, and if you don't worry about it. It's not essential to know. But this is an ongoing process, but the more that you do it, the more you're able to see in a self-evident way that has the nature of understanding a proof. So that's critical, because there's a fusion here. This is the place where I'm highlighting. I think there's a meaningful difference between what I'm trying to do and the millennia of mystical traditions that I think have been highlighting a very similar terrain. I am not just saying, oh, focus on the mind, then you have this transcendent experience. I think that there's something very important about interweaving the perception of the mind with mental content that is about what this process is and how it relates to something like memetics, so that the mind has enough information to be of service in shaping the evolutionary environment and its evolutionary processes, so that it can continue to support ever-growing clarity. I'm focusing on the level of the individual. There's a reason to think that this is fractal. But I want to pause there and see if there's any more comments yet. Aha! It seems like... so if you're making comments, I'm not seeing them, and because I'm at the bottom of the scrolling thing. So that's quite all right. Okay. So where does all this go? One of the major effects that happens from this whole process is that there is a transformation of the sense of self, because that's usually living over here in the mind. By default, that's living over here in the mind. I talked before when I was referencing no need for should. The structure, the internal structure of how this sense of self operates, how it feels on the inside. That experience often has a lot of pain associated with it. And a lot of difficulty and struggle and strife and what is wrong with me? That's not universal, but it's a lot closer to universal than you might think. Even people who have an enormous amount of pride and confidence very often are coming from a compensatory response to try to get away from that pain. Now, there's a lot of structural reasons for this. It relates to mimetic evolution. It relates closely to mimetic evolution. And I went over a lot of that in that video, if I remember right. The thing is that sense of self only works because it sort of is in this an epistemic bubble. It's in this pocket of not being seen clearly by the mind. This is one of the reasons why Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, that is directed at, well, who am I? This is a Zen koan. Who awakens? Who is it that asks these questions? Who awakens? And if you focus on that question, it will only take you 20 years to recognize the answer. There's a cultural reason for that kind of draw out. But um, if you focus your attention on this structure of the self, it sort of forces the mind to reorganize in a way that will it will sort of pop the bubble of this sense of self. It doesn't destroy it, but on the inside it can often feel like that. It can feel like a sense of dissolving. If you keep doing this enough times, eventually you can get to a place where the sense of self becomes like this icon I've been referring to before, becomes a pointer back to conscious awareness. There's kind of a tipping point that for some people happens very abruptly, for others it happens in glimpses that occur over longer and longer periods and more intensely. This is the whole gradual enlightenment versus sudden awakening distinction. But I also want to highlight that there's a lot of confusion around the word enlightenment. I claim that there's at least two different kinds of experiences about this. One is this transformation of the sense of self and the relationship between the mind and consciousness. That when that becomes, when there's a tipping point where the sense of identity is much more systematically pointed at the consciousness, that often comes with, when it's sudden, it comes with an experience that a lot of people will have in transpersonal experiences in psychedelics. But this can also happen in cases of meditation, and sometimes it just hits spontaneously in different situations, that causes people to say, oh, I am enlightened. And it is a kind of enlightenment. It's part of the process, but it's not the full non-dual thing. It's not the full recognition of the ground of all being. There is farther to go. I'm not trying to focus so much on that farther to go, because I don't think that's as key for releasing the acute suffering that we as individuals are currently in, and for addressing the meta crisis that our species is in. I also don't think we need everybody to get the transpersonal experience. But I do think that there is something about moving towards this transpersonal experience. If you want to look this stuff up later, the distinction I'm making is in Vipassana, this is the difference between the arising and passing away event, which is this transpersonal thing, versus nirvana, the actual full recognition. In Jewish Kabbalistic mysticism, this is the difference between Tifereth and Kether. In Rinzai Zen, this is the difference between Kensho and full awakening. And so there's a bunch of different references that make this distinction. So when I'm talking about this state, I'm talking about the lesser one. I think that it's a lot more accessible than we typically want to talk about. And another way to look this up is if you listen to people talking about transpersonal experiences from psychedelics like mushrooms, and you compare that to the transpersonal experiences that people have on 5-MeO-DMT, an example of that is in Bufo, B-U-F-O. The difference between those is very clear. I think it's very clear. So I'm talking about the lesser one. So when that shift happens, when you actually create space for that kind of shift, or when you create space for that kind of shift, there is on the inside, the actual lived experience is often some version of something like realizing that you are. That you have always been. There's a kind of eternalness to the experience, a sense of I've always known this. What has always known this? And there's something about the question that's kind of like, that's noise. That's noise. That's the machine. That's the machine I've been letting live my life for me. And I'm trying to describe this as a universal experience. I'm describing one kind of angle on a cluster. This cluster can have a bunch of variations, but this is a common thread. There is a sense of clarity, like in Western ceremonial magic, they call this attainment knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. I think that that's kind of a misnomer. It's more like recognizing, rather than I have a higher self, it's more like you get, I have always been my higher self. Talking about it as the higher self is absurd. I am the higher self. I am the holy guardian angel, and I have a human to take care of. But it's not really like an entity. It's like, oh, I've got this machine. I've got this mortal suit. I've got a mind. I've got emotions. I've got a body. I've got this ego thing. I've got these things to take care of, and its experiences and its suffering matter, but I am beyond that. Now, I'm describing this in ways that are, in some sense, I hope, accessible to the cognition of the mind. When people experience this, there's a kind of a vividness to the way in which this is beyond description, which is to say it's beyond a lot of the default settings for a mind. And also the thing itself is an experience that is beyond the mind. The same way that when you taste a banana, you can describe the taste of a banana, and you can understand the biochemistry that's involved, and you can examine how banana flavor relates to other flavors. But all of that examination is incapable of capturing the actual taste. All it can do is point at the taste. So there's a way in which it is beyond the mind in a very fundamental sense like that, the recognition of your transcendent nature. I also want to emphasize in saying this, because I have a lot of folk here who have a sort of a mimetic allergy to attempts to defy the materialist paradigm. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to claim that there is a reality beyond the physical. I am trying to say that the thing that is called the physical is actually a mental model. Like the word physical often points to another part of the mind that has this idea of a physical world, of reality. It's a very small thing. And there is a lot that is beyond the physical, but there's nothing that's beyond the physical. The word physical comes from the Greek physikos, which is also where we get physics from, which literally means nature. So physical and natural are just like, that's the Greek and Latin versions of the same word, etymologically speaking. So I'm not trying to say that there is a spirit ghost beyond the realm of science. What I'm trying to highlight is there's a type of experience that the models of science and the ideology that tends to get put around things like materialism tend to ignore because they don't have a place to put them. There isn't a clear place to put consciousness in this little model because it's over here. It's not here. This is one of the causes, I claim, of the philosophical hard problem of consciousness. The mind creates these isolated pockets and has these fissures, the things I've been talking about as cracks or the shattering of the psyche. It has a lot of difficulty orienting systematically to the actual nature of consciousness. When you correct that, there is a sense of what I thought was real is laughable. But when you translate that back into the standard physical paradigm, this can sound like, I believe in God, I believe in ghosts, and that's not what's being said. Okay. I don't know if that puts any mimetic immune systems at ease, but that's an attempt to gesture towards, I'm not trying to claim that consciousness is beyond the physical world. I'm trying to claim that it is beyond the thoughts of the physical world. And if you don't know the difference between thoughts and experience, if your mind doesn't systematically reflect the difference between thoughts and experience, that can sound like a claim that consciousness is beyond the realm of physics. That's not what I mean. Okay, I'm glancing at the comments, see one more. Linda saying, there is a thing where after I have understood a concept, e.g. a math concept, it is almost impossible to imagine not knowing it. Yeah. There's a huge rant that is associated with this about teaching. about that tendency tends to break down the bridging to people who haven't had the insight. This is one of the really frustrating things I keep seeing in a huge amount of mystical teaching and ideas, because there's this bizarre pressure towards saying useless statements like realize the oneness. Oh, just meditate. Okay, if you've ever tried to, if you've ever thought meditation would be a good idea and then tried to establish a meditation habit, you've probably encountered the way in which that's not plausible. I don't mean that it's not physically something you can do. I mean it's not viable. It's like for most people, you can't just decide to start meditating. Most people can't do it. This isn't because they're incompetent. It's not because there's something wrong with them. It's because of where they are. There's this weird tendency in a lot of mystical teachings to just assert, well, be like me. And this is the same thing that causes a lot of, causes mathematicians to often be terrible math teachers. They just say, oh, well, it's very easy. It's just this concept. And then they stare at people not getting it and going, well, why aren't you just understanding? Why don't you try more? Like, why don't you try more, Professor? So there's a deep transformation that I very much relate to, where when you actually get wise knowing of something, it becomes the default thing the mind will do is sort of vividly, oh yeah, of course that's true. I ever thought it wasn't. I was insane. It's sort of like looking back at what you were like, I don't know, before puberty, and then trying to relate to what sex is. That's maybe a bad example because some people, I know some specific people who look at that and say, no, actually, I went insane. Like puberty drove me nuts. I was more me when I was 12. And I think that there's something very valid and important about that view as well. But when you go through a transformation of understanding that is experiential, it can often create a lack of connection to where you were before. There's an additional thing, and this I think is one of the defining characteristics of being a good teacher. It's something that I strive to do, sort of have very mixed results here, because it's hard. It's very hard. But this is the actual work. This is one of the key aspects of work of being a good teacher, which is, can you, after getting the insight, then go back and really get a sense that relates to the actual insight, what it is like to not have it. Not just remembering, because sometimes the memory gets wiped, but being able to sort of remodel it, come up with a new model of this that accurately captures the experience of students, in the case of teachers, trying to do this. And what are the steps that make going from this pre-understanding place to an understanding? What does that actually look like on the inside for a person? Telling someone to do better doesn't help, but telling them, oh, so where in your body do you feel the frustration? Like, that's not accessible to everybody, but this is one of the kinds of, that's closer to the kind of question that I would find myself wanting to ask when dealing with a student. Like, okay, well, you're feeling frustrated. What exactly is the experience of frustration for you, and where is it directed? Like, what's going on for you? What's your mental and emotional experience of this? Is the frustration of I've got to get this, or is it, God damn it, why won't my mind do the thing I want it to? If it's that second one, then I can zoom in on details, because that's telling me, oh, the step here isn't plausible to you. Maybe we need to go through a different route. So yeah, this is a highly non-trivial domain. It's pretty major, and it's related to the vision that I have for the world, but it's not directly connected to this key insight about getting the mind to reflect the nature of consciousness in a more systematic way. It's sort of step two, recognizing that step two after that. It's like, now you're pre-enlightened. Now let's actually get to work. So, yeah, so let's see. I want to orient a little bit more here. So Now, I'd mentioned at the beginning, this is something that I'd wanted to talk about instead that came to mind when I was staring at this question of looking at meaning, what John Vervaeke refers to as the meaning crisis. Let's see, do I actually want to go in that direction? I think what I actually want to point at, which is the same thing, is just from a slightly different lens. The process that I just described, I described from the perspective of an individual. But this is a fractal process. It happens at all scales. There's a way that this vividly applies to the nature of how memes work. So I'm going to scale this up as an intuition pump. This is I think that when you actually see the thing that I'm talking about, which is not about conceptually understanding, it's about creating the reflection between consciousness and concept that develops wise knowing. When you have wise knowing of the thing that I'm pointing at, you'll see the way in which this intuition pump is an intuition pump. It's not quite accurate. It's importantly not quite accurate. And I think that there's a piece that I haven't fully seen myself yet. Like I can feel some of the tension that suggests, okay, I'm a little confused right here, and my mind needs to focus here. But because it's confused, I have a hard time describing it. So, which is not a universal property of developing wise knowing. It's a quirk of when you're reflecting consciousness and the relationship between mind and consciousness. You often get domains that, oh, I know I'm confused here, but I don't know how to describe why I'm confused. So if you imagine that instead of talking about an individual relating to their mind, we're talking about the human race. This is actually a very natural scaling, because what are you? You as an individual, in some sense, you could think of yourself as, you could do this as a community of psychological subparts. This is very popular with internal family systems, Gestalt therapy. You could also look at the fact that there was some kind of transition from some of our most ancient ancestors being multicellular blobs. And then somehow those the broadcast has been paused? Oh, that's interesting. I don't see anything like that on my end. Can you guys hear me? I would hope so, and if not, then I don't know what to do, because my end claims I'm broadcasting just fine. I'm gonna guess that for whatever reason there's some sort of transmission glitch going on, and that often when that happens, it's recording anyway. So it's so I'll make a note here. By text is everything claims to be fine on my end. Let me know if it starts coming through. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to continue in part because I'm expecting that even if the connection has somehow broken, that it's still recording and that you might be able to view this in the replay. So if you imagine the way in which the oh, that is unfortunate. Ronnie is saying that it's still creating a problem. Yeah, I don't know what else to do here. Yeah, I'll make one more comment here and then I'll continue. Well, I don't have a fix. I see to do. So I'll continue in case the recording still works. Oh, Linda says you can hear me now. Okay, great. All right. Ha! Yay! Great. I don't know what that was about. On my end, it claims to be fine. It'll be funny to see if the replay actually captures. Okay, great. All right, that was a misunderstanding. Awesome. All right, then I shall continue. All right. So some of our most ancient ancestors would have been multicellular blobs. And clearly at some point there was some kind of shift such that, well, I don't like the sense of self that I have, that is in my mind, that my mind is using in the background here, is like it's a software abstraction. It's more like a program and less like a collection of cells. Now, it's a software program running on cells, sure. So claims the mind. It's not a direct experience, but okay, whatever. All of this is mental. Trying to get the mind on board with this picture is a fascinating project. Oh, I believe in the ancient history. Good. Have you seen it? No, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, yes, that's true. And are you pointing at experience? Yes. Okay. So anyway, I think it's helpful to have a little bit of playfulness here. So, right, so there's this software sense of self that sort of emerges. It's different from the multicellular blob. There is some kind of transition that happened along the way. Well, that's interesting. So one way of thinking of where I see the human race going is a similar kind of transition where we're playing something like the role of psychological parts or the role of cells. And there is a need for the human race to have a lesser awakening, for it to become self-aware. So again, this is an intuition pump. I think it's a very important and valuable intuition pump, and I'm going to point at some of the ways that I expect the transition to actually be experienced. And I've gotten glimpses of this myself, a sort of depth of resonance. But you can see some hint of this if you look at the way that perhaps you, but certainly a lot of people, I know that I've experienced this. I've had a lot of experiences of feeling like I'm at war with myself. God damn it, I want to make sure that I'm doing yoga every day, but am I just forcing myself to do things that I don't want to do? But like sometimes I need to do the things that I don't want to do because they're actually good for me and they actually help me to calibrate. And what about getting rid of this should thing? And it seems like there's a lot of should here. But like if I just don't do anything, I'll just keep, if I don't create some kind of change, and I'll just be in the same loops. And how do that's my version. Like I'll fly into this like internal soup of confusion. Like, how do I do better? How do I earn my existence? Other people have different variations. I've encountered people who get into a strong role of condemnation, sometimes of themselves, sometimes of other people, and feeling bad about that condemnation, or feeling righteous about the condemnation and getting defensive if it's attacked. And there's all kinds of strategies. But there's the way that there's something like an inner war that's actually accurate. That part isn't just an intuition pump. It's a metaphor, but it's kind of funny because the metaphor of war, of a mimetic war, of memes having wars, which is what's going on in the psyche, and it's also the same thing that's going on in culture. It's a war of memes. Using war as a metaphor, as a metaphoric anchor, is hilarious because physical war is the result of mimetic war. I don't mean every fight between groups, and I don't mean every battle. But if you have anything that you could call a war, that is the physical manifestation of a mimetic war every time. I dare you to find an exception, and there might be an exception, and that doesn't break the thing that I'm trying to point at. But it's kind of hilarious to look at that. But that's a tangent. So this kind of inner conflict. Actually, that's not something that's sort of a tangent that accidentally went in the direction of my point. The one major way of sorting out this inner war is, rather than trying to put in effort, which is more war, to make one side win over the other, and then have this pressure of this interlocking, this like blah blah, like you can't get there. That path can't get you there because you're identifying with some of these meme structures, which is to say the mind doesn't have a consistent way of having the self point outside of the mimetic garden. You're identifying and often switching your identity around on the inside of this war and applying weird pressures, like who are even you when doing this. One of the ways of creating Vipassana style insight that creates this snap is to ask, who is it that is trying? Just to watch, who am I? Just watch that process. It breaks down very quickly because it turns out the sense of self in the mimetic garden is incredibly inconsistent. It is utterly incoherent. It's mind shatter. It's insane. When you actually see it clearly, there's a sense of, how did I ever think? It's sort of like 2 toothpicks, a fork, a cup, and government. That's myself. Right? And I'll just ignore the fact that that makes no goddamn sense. In fact, I will fight to protect it. I go, okay, who's fighting to protect it? So, if you can actually look that way, if you can stop believing the mind's nonsense about this, then there becomes a nucleation point, which is consciousness itself. This isn't just having one mimetic corner win out over the rest. It ends up being something like that, but the meme that wins out, if you're going to use that kind of metaphor, the meme that wins out in the mimetic evolution, or the meme cluster, is the cluster that is devoted to truth and creating this accurate reflection of reality, including the existence of consciousness, or the coherent subjective experience of subjectivity, I should say. And as you get that, the incoherence of the war starts to dissolve, and you create an inner focus. This starts to create the kind of thing, create/emerge, the kind of thing that I've referred to as the true free will. You are unifying all of the different forces of your psyche and getting it to connect more consistently with your body energies. The whole thing becomes coherent because it's nucleating around consciousness instead of ideas that claim to be conscious. Okay. So there's a footnote that I want to get to here, having to do with there's actually a way where this critically stirs up trauma and breaks down a lot of the structures that are responsible for keeping trauma from overwhelming the system. That's an important note to get to. And if for some reason I don't hop back to that, either because I ran out of time or I just forget, I just want to make sure that you know there's a caveat here. And this relates very closely to this business of learning to be okay with any sensation. There's actually something very critical there that often is more important than cultivating wise knowing as a prerequisite, which is one of the reasons why I emphasized it earlier on. But I'll add that as a footnote and I'll see if I can come back to it. So if we take that process and we scale it up, if you look at the human race, I think it's obvious that the human race has the same kind of incoherence. If you look at its mind, like imagine that the internet is the fastest part, the fastest thinking part of the human race mind, the human species mind. Now, some of that modulation makes sense, like the parts having to do with making communication about a university shouldn't intertwine with 4chan. Like that's that's going to be very confused. So some divisions make sense. I'm not anti-partition. Like that's not what I'm trying to emphasize. That's a very powerful effect of McGilchrist's model of the left hemisphere. I think that's a very important aspect. But when you have cases like right now, when extreme in the United States is the alt-right versus Antifa, and then you also get these other factions that are going, those two look awfully similar and that's scary. Right? This is an aspect of the culture wars where you're getting, and the culture wars are mimetic war. It's a mimetic battlefield. So we're observing the incoherence that is coming from the species trying to sort out its own internal incoherence by trying to make one side win. But there's no cohering process to pick which side wins. So all you can do is allow mimetic infection to possess people to decide which side they're going to side with and say, these are the true good guys and those are the evil guys. But it's symmetric. Like there's no sanity organizing the whole thing. It's just whatever memes happen to infect you to control what thoughts you have and what thoughts move you about what you're considering to be politically moral. For instance, this is across the board. This is the same thing that happened with religion in the Middle Ages, with the Reformation, the triggering of the witch trials and all that whole spiel. I just happen to be much more familiar with the details of Western history. I'm pretty sure there are lots of examples everywhere in the world. So there's this. So the question of, well, what needs to happen to create coherence? Well, it can't be by picking a meme and saying that one should win, the rest of you are bad. Right? That's not going to work. For the same reason, it's not going to work to create internal coherence by making your inner critic stronger. I am bad if I don't do yoga. I'm bad if I make myself do yoga. It's just like, yes, guided by the beauty of our weapons. Yeah. When I said symmetric earlier, I was referring directly to that essay. The language is terrible because you're distinguishing between a symmetric weapon and an asymmetric weapon. Just in English, it's terrible, but the concepts are beautiful and super important. So it seems to me that you can do the same thing on the species scale in basically the same way. A big key aspect of this is, well, where is the self that is experiencing all of this, that everything is coalescing around? This is where, now I'm not as confident about the following point, but I think that it's very evocative, and I think it points in a correct-ish direction. As far as I can tell, this starts to tap into a direction that systematically causes people to hallucinate by asking their minds to compute the answer. But most minds that are doing this don't have a systematic way of referencing back to the consciousness that is at the center of the whole thing. So the computations go off and do some kind of weird thing and come back with these bizarre conclusions. These bizarre conclusions involve things like, well, consciousness is obviously a computational process as I understand computation. And because here's my box, this is the whole universe, and then inside of this little universe, clearly here's consciousness, so it's here, and this must be going on. There's something very weird going on there. That doesn't mean that it's entirely wrong, but there's a disconnect that's happening in the reasoning process. And that disconnect, I claim, has dramatic implications for the capacity to let reality in to inform the model. So you end up with some really curious claims like, well, if we just arrange computation over here, like what happens when a corporation becomes conscious? And we're treating it like the consciousness is happening out here, like it's some sort of mysterious thing. But that's treating consciousness like it's an observable external, like it's an object that appears when you do some kind of mental thing. That's as though consciousness is over here in what the mind does. This mistake keeps happening over and over and over again whenever I hear people trying to orient to this question. I don't claim to have this sync up perfect. I've clearly passed the tipping point. It's incredibly clear, which is to say that there's a particular experience that has made an enormous amount of this really vivid in a way that was not accessible to me before, and I can see this. Daniel Ingram, the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, once in a conversation I was having with him, referred to this as going through spiritual puberty. There's some things that you just can't get until that happens. And there's certain conversations that just can't be had with people before that transition. And so what I'm saying is, okay, well, it's super obvious. I've had that transition. Other people have had that transition. Doesn't mean that we're better. It's just there's a thing there. But that at the same time doesn't mean that I have this sync up down all the way. And part of what I'm trying to do is build a bridge across puberty. I keep wanting to emphasize something like, I really want to underline the importance. This is a tangent, but I feel like it's a really important one. It speaks to something deep about the heart. It's actually really critical that this has absolutely nothing to do with being better or worse. There's no superiority here. There's no status thing. And sometimes I forget that on the inside. So sometimes some ego stuff slips in a way that is not aligned with this kind of tracking and this depth of truth. I am actually just trying to describe structures of reality that I want to invite everybody to eventually come to have a relationship with. I want to emphasize that in part because I hope that makes it a little bit easier to hear. But I'm saying there is something that I have seen that a lot of people haven't seen. And that's not a matter of me being better. It's a matter of, oh, look, I've seen something. Here, let me show you. And I'm intending to come from that kind of clarity. And that's part of my own inner work, is to be systematically clear that way rather than thinking that and coming across as there being anything special about me because of that. So, best as I can tell in doing this sync up, when we scale up to the species level, on the inside, what it feels like for the species to start to wake up like this. Well, remember that the concept of the species is actually an emergent mimetic thing. Like the same way that you're going to have a meta meme in your own psyche that reflects back your consciousness to you. I think the same thing will eventually be true of the human species in the version of our future where we thrive instead of die. In that future, there would be a meme that reflects back to consciousness that is part of the cultural groundwater that is about tracking memes. But memes run on humans. Memes don't think in the abstract. They aren't these floating ghosts. What it means for a meme to figure something out, like I gave an example of Santa Claus, the Santa Claus meme, using adults in order to figure out how to cast a magical experience on children. And the way that that uses the structures of the adults' beliefs, the way that the meme is logged into the adults, such that the adults don't have to believe in Santa in order for Santa to become real in the experience of children through the actions of the adults. That thinking happens on the hardware of adults. So when you look at, well, what would that meta meme in the culture feel like in the lived experience of a conscious being, like in the lived experience of a human, when that meme passes through? I think what it would feel like is a remembrance that the center of consciousness is not abstract, it's right there. It is not that the human species is waking up, it is that you are waking up. You are remembering your full true body. You are remembering that the extent of your mind is the universe. Now that is not instead of your sense of self as an individual. It's merged with. It's both and. It's a dynamic polarity, because that whole species level thing has to care for each of the parts of its psyche to bring them into harmony. But bringing them into harmony doesn't mean making them the same. Differentiation remains a major evolutionary advantage. Is that having differentiation, like the fact that our skin cells are different from our nerve cells, which are different from our liver cells, that differentiation is part of what makes us so adaptive and so flexible in what it is that we are capable of doing. So part of the way that this would be experienced is a vivid sense of, right, I am, for lack of a better term, I am God. I am the emerging consciousness of the entire human race. I am the super intelligence that is the coordinated, coherent structure of the entire species. That coherent structure, there's just work to do. Like there's a transition point. This is achieving Tifereth. This is the Kensho experience. This is the species going through this, is this recognition that creates synergy between the parts, where yes, I am the center of consciousness, and I recognize the way in which that makes that the center of consciousness according to that part, and that matters. The human that consciousness is radiating through matters. The human that this consciousness is radiating through matters. But it's the same thing. The consciousness there is the consciousness here. It is the human race, and this is the center. Although from that perspective, that is the center. You are awakening. I don't think you need the whole human race to get that for this to work. I also want to emphasize there's this thing about this is an intuition pump. This is not. I feel like I'm missing some piece of this. So this hasn't hit the point of me having wise knowing about that being the result. But I think that it gestures in a right-ish direction. It evokes intuitions that. This is like the mathematician's intuition of, I bet that there's a proof in this direction. I have that kind of sense about this sort of thought experiment. Not that it's right, but that it's evocative of something that I bet is useful. In the same way that you don't need every cell in your body to be a brain cell, right? You just need every cell in your body to be responsive to your brain cells in some sense in order for your being to have coherence around what your mind does. In the same way, I don't think that you actually need the entire human race to get this in a fully consciously accessible way in order for there to be global coherence, to cause an awakening of the human race. I don't know what the tipping point is. I don't have enough of a, I don't have a good mathematical model that I have any confidence in for suggesting what the tipping point would be. Ken Wilber claims that each transition that has similarity to this requires that you only get about 10% of the population. I don't know where he gets that figure from. So that's the general direction that I'm seeing. I'm wanting to, there are 2 points that I wanted to loop back to. One is this question of, well, how is this tying to meaning, which is nominally the title of this video, is the dealing with the meaning crisis. And this question of internal safety while going through the process. Let me just quickly see, sometimes this doesn't scroll down to comments. Okay, I've not seen any comments. Normally y'all are a lot more talkative. I don't mind you just listening, or if you've all abandoned, that's all fine too. But I'm a little curious about what's going on for you if you're listening. So I'm going to be wrapping up pretty soon here. Okay, so these other 2 points, very briefly. See if I can do brief. Brief has never been a strong suit of mine when I'm intuiting and trying to feel out how to say something that feels simple on the inside and takes a lot of words to say on the outside. Let me touch on the safety one first, because I think it's more important that get in here. There's a kind of practice that I gave a bunch of people about a year ago, when I was first looking at this, saying, no, look, actually, look at your mind. You can see, you can actually watch in real time your mind distracting yourself. And I can describe that practice. It's actually very simple. I may go through and offer this practice later on. It doesn't require years of meditation. You can actually, you can kind of break some of the bullshit memes in your psyche with a single act of effort. You don't break all of them, but you can break some of them in very interesting ways that can create a lot of illumination. This had a very profound effect on a group of, what was it, about 30-ish people at a workshop I ran back in Seattle around June or July, I think it was, last year. This had a wonderful effect on quite a lot of people, very shaking, very profound. And part of that also was verifying that, oh, great, what I am seeing, there's something like, oh yes, I'm glad that my math proof actually works when we apply it. There's like a satisfaction. It's like the scientist's satisfaction of, well, I know that my theory is right when I follow the logic, but also doing the experiment and seeing the experiment work out is really affirming, and it was still a necessary step. Because sometimes, no matter how confident you are, you can still miss something, and that's why it's important to check reality. So seeing this impact on people was like enormously affirming. But there was at least one person there who had a pretty dramatic effect of part of what cracked open for her reopened a bunch of feelings that had previously driven her towards suicidal tendencies. right? So like that's pretty significant. Like if part of the way of adapting to a trauma uses a bunch of these distraction strategies and you crack it open, then suddenly you don't have your defenses. Your only defense was distraction. Your only defense was mind shatter. Now what? Okay. So this effect will happen, like not necessarily with that degree of trauma, but certainly that degree of profundity, of interconnection, of breaking down a lot of the bullshit that tries to keep you safe from certain kinds of experiences. And sometimes those experiences, because they're too intense, because of the way that the mind is structured, can actually result in pretty intensely bad internal experiences. Right. So this that there is a risk that is worth accounting for. If you that kind of breakdown is going to happen as the mind attunes to truth, because all of the bullshit is there for a reason. And you're going to encounter those reasons as you go through it. So one of the things that I think is really critical for this to work in practice, my hope is that this becomes a matter of wise knowing. You can eventually just see this for yourself. But as a matter of safety, and also because I think it's freeing and it's relieving, it's really useful, is to build up the capacity to be with intensity, which you can do largely separately from the process of breaking down the bullshit structures of the psyche. The two very much synergize. But if you can't, for instance, be with the feeling of shame, if you can't be with a feeling of shame, if when you get ashamed, you go, I can't, I'm so sorry, I'm bad. Like if that's your response to the slightest glimmer of shame or the slightest thought that somebody might disapprove of you, the chances are that when you eliminate your mind's ability to distract you from those experiences, you are going to feel devastated. So it becomes really, really, really valuable to train your mind in little bits and pieces. This is like doing weightlifting. You start with things like, I don't like looking at that slug. I just notice I don't like the feeling of looking at that slug. Cool, you don't like the feeling. Can you be with the feeling anyway? You don't have to torture yourself, but can you make it so that you can eliminate the flinch away? Some people would, some people in the rationality community I was a part of down in Berkeley would recognize this as ugh field. Can you dissolve the ugh field, the ugh feeling? A lot of dissolving the ugh field, I think, can just be done by raw being with the feeling, breathing into it, and making it more familiar. I don't think you need to seek out bad experiences to do that. This is just a matter of noticing what arises, what internal body sensations arise, and getting good at making it so that those can't control you. The reason being that at some point, if you go in the direction I'm talking about, at some point something is going to crack open and you're likely to bump into the terror of duality that is at the core of the sense of self. If you have no ability, no developed ability to be with intensity, well, like, if you want to have a pretty clear sense of this, I would recommend, and you're willing to do some work to dig into this, this is about the second, the higher form of enlightenment. But I would recommend going and listening to Kieran Trace talk about her awakening experience. She had no awakening background, no spiritual readings, nothing. She just was tying her shoelaces and then suddenly had a non-dual experience. And it ripped away all of her capacity to deal with her enormously effervescent store of trauma. And it just all bubbled to the surface, and she was in non-dual hell for a couple of years, which was also bliss, but it was also hell. And she now helps people to go through this kind of realization and ease and so on, roughly speaking. If you listen to her, it's more complex than that. But this is part of why I think that it is so important to develop this robustness. Part of it is a matter of becoming immune to the basic hooking methods that a lot of bullshit memes use in order to encourage internal deception. but it's also making it so that you can stand the truth. It's not that the truth is awful, but that there is a belief that the truth is awful. The belief that you can't stand these experiences is still in the mind. So training the mind to get used to, oh, it turns out I can actually tolerate experience. I can be with any experience. Getting the mind to really get that, not as a concept, but as a lived practice thing, makes it a lot easier when some of these walls come down. It's not essential, but I think it's a lot nicer. And also learning to unhook that stuff, I think, is pragmatically, it's one of the most immediately useful things you can do in your life. Because the ability to not be reactive in your interactions with others is one of the most powerful tools you have available to, like one of the fastest, the combination of fastest and most powerful, like the combo of those, is the highest in terms of helping making your relationships better. In terms of your experience of them, your enjoyment of them, other people's experience of you, although hopefully you don't obsess too much about other people's experience of you. That's one of the things to eventually let go of. Okay. So that's the safety thing. I still have the meaning thing, which I might or might not get to. Let me see, there's another comment here. Marcella says, so it seems part of what you're saying is that English, the way most people use it, doesn't actually have a first-person pronoun. It just has the grammatically first-person I that ends up being used to refer to the speaker in the third person. Yeah, kind of. When you actually do the Vipassana process of tracking where the sense of self goes, what it's doing, it'll turn out that it's not even a coherent third person. But the closest that you get to a coherent third person is when you're talking about social interactions. You're saying, oh yeah, I went over to Joey's house and the two of us played some video games, and then I went to make myself some Doritos and pull out some Doritos and munch on those, and that was fun. That sense of I has some sense of coherence because it's pointing at the social icon. But the social icon is this mental object. It's not pointing at the consciousness by default. Yeah. Being able to cultivate an actual coherent use of the concept of I is very powerful, and it's also very strange because it's vastly more coherent than the thing that we normally use. Part of the reason the sense of self seems coherent is because of the mind shatter thing, because of the way that the mind has a terrible model of itself and has blind spots over its own gaps. Yeah. Very briefly on the point of meaning, so if I can squeeze this in. My read of why there is a meaning crisis is that there is an attempt to derive meaning over here in the mind. The solution of ignore the mind and focus on experience has something going for it, but the part that I think it has going for it is focus on experience. This is one of the reasons to talk about bright desire, the cohering factor of the mind, looking at what is it that you delight in. But the ignore the mind's efforts to create meaning doesn't address the mind shatter thing that creates this weirdness of, oh, if I have a model of the world that have this nihilistic vacuum somewhere in it, then and like I have to relate this to other concepts in order to try to shuffle around. Like there's still a problem to deal with, which is that there is a dimension of the mind that if you tap into is horrifying. Right? There's still something to address there. So what happens when that gets evoked? So it seems to me that the meaning crisis is not actually a crisis of meaning, it is a crisis of mental architecture. This gets resolved not by having some sort of tremendous philosophy, although I think philosophy ends up being part of the answer in the original meaning of the phrase, philosophia, the love of wisdom. If the human race can coalesce around devotion to truth, that starts to have some real sense of meaning. Vervaeke talks about, John Vervaeke, the cognitive scientist I referred to, who introduced me to the term meaning crisis. He references how the sense of meaningfulness often comes with psychological flow and with experiences of higher states of consciousness. A lot of what I'm talking about is a structural way of orienting towards higher states of consciousness. Instead of making them like this, profound thing, maybe we can access this in some sort of way. Not like I'm saying there's actually a very direct path. You can actually just go that way. You can't control when you get there because you can't see the inside of your mind with your mind, because that's the problem. That's part of the reason it feels like it's coming from nowhere. Or why you don't have control over it, because the icon, the liver cells in the body don't have that. Something changed on my screen. Yeah, okay, looks fine. But there's a very coherent process for creating the experience of meaning. But I also think that this has cognitive content that matters as the mind orients towards this anchoring in experience, which is very closely, it's related to this business of, well, what happens, like what is it to participate in the awakening of the human race? When I talk about this being fractal, I don't just mean that what's going on in the psyche is analogous to what's going on in the culture. What's going on in the culture is not just like, it is a reflection of, it is the scaling up of the phenomena that are happening in each person's psyche. It turns out, for interesting game theoretic and mimetic reasons, that they end up with a symmetry. In certain magical circles, they'll reference this, like under the Hermetic law from Hellenistic Egyptian mysticism, with as above, so below, as within, so without. I suspect they didn't have, I don't know how much they were referring to this, but I think that they may have been intuiting something in this direction, this kind of game theoretic relationship. The process of fixing the world is recognizing that the world, as far as I can tell, this is my supposition, what I'm seeing, fixing the world isn't something you can do. Because as long as you are this thing over here in the mind, you're just shoving, you're getting possessed by more of the mimetics. You can't actually participate in a meaningful way in making things different in the world. I'm going to describe this kind of binary. I don't mean it quite this binary, but I think the binary thing highlights the thing that I want to point at. The way that you adjust this, as far as I can tell, is that you recognize that the world is a reflection of processes that are happening within each person's psyche. And you offer an alternative mimetic structure by embodying it, by making it useful to yourself, by having the deep internal devotion to truth, not as a concept, not as a feeling, but as an actual reorganization of your internal mimetic world, in a way that lets you show up to others to make that clear. Now, there's a whole art. This has to do with the thing that I've referred to before about the question of viability. And that is honestly worth its own video at some point. About how do we do this sync up without trying to get into manipulating the other and getting into weird mimetic wars that cause more of the glitch. How do we create clarity? I have partial answers. I don't have a complete answer. If I had a complete answer, this would become a viral meta meme that would spread at a super exponential rate. So demonstrably, I don't have the answer yet. But as far as I can tell, the short version is, this is like a long route around to a variation on Gandhi's quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world." But rather than believing it because Gandhi said it and it feels good to listen to Gandhi and it resonates, I claim you can actually give the mind enough handles on this that you can see the details of how that would work, and the gestalt and the whole. Left brain and right brain, both of the aspects in their entirety. That, to me, is an enormously promising direction for creating meaning, for overcoming the meaning crisis. Not only is it a matter of engendering higher states of consciousness and flow, that's sort of like looking at it third person, but it's actually on the inside. You can help everyone, the whole race, pull out of this insanity and become something coherent and beautiful and sane and kind by trying to do the same thing with yourself. So that's the arc that I wanted to go through today. I'm actually pretty pleased I managed to touch on the meaning crisis even at the end there. I don't see any other comments, so I'm happy to wrap up. Thank you for watching. And today is the last day of my promising to post every day. I think I mentioned this at the start. I am very likely to continue doing some posts and videos because I still have a lot to say and I have a lot to explore, and I'm still articulating some of the things that I've already tried to say, and going through more articulation arcs seems valuable. But yeah, what I'm letting go of is the promise that I am going to post something every day. But keep an eye out. I don't intend to go months without saying anything, and maybe a couple days. Just give myself a breather. Thank you so much for watching, and yeah, I'll talk with you all later.